When I was only 10 years old, my first guitar teacher, a man named Tim Eichel, sent me home with this record, and it changed my life. About a year later, I met one of my oldest friends on the planet, one of my very best friends on the planet. Not a room in this house doesn't remind me of Michael. Books, records, films. Michael Kirkland, from the Brothers Four. Michael arranged for me to meet BB, and that was when I was about 12 years old. At the time, I thought it was like an exclusive thing. I didn't know that BB, as a matter of routine, did that for everyone after the show. If you wanted to meet BB King, he said, without you, there's no me. He's an incredibly gracious man. I think of BB often when I see these large YouTubers who won't even reply to a comment. From there, I met the most animated and memorable high school English teacher anybody could have ever had, Dale Knuth. He wound up sending me home with a bunch of tapes. Albert King and Otis Rush. Still got his handwriting on the little label. Muddy Waters. And after school, I'd sit there and he'd let me listen to music. Waiting for my mother to pick me up to take me to a guitar lesson. He turned me on to J.B. Lenoir, the Eisenhower Blues, Ronnie Earl and the Broadcasters. I wound up at the Chet Atkins Appreciation Society in Nashville, Tennessee, and became interested in fingerstyle guitar playing, but was already a total and complete blues hound. And when I wanted to study fingerpicking, I wound up going to spend Saturday afternoons on Queen Anne Hill in Seattle, Washington, with John Miller, first degree blues, and with no disrespect intended to anyone else who ever showed me anything on guitar. John Miller was the most important guitar teacher of my life. He taught me ear training, he taught me how to transcribe music, and he turned me on to a bunch of blues. Mance Lipscomb, Lightnin' Hopkins, Memphis Minnie, Blind Boy Fuller, Skip James, Furry Lewis, Blind Lemon Jefferson. While all of that was going on, my dad's friend, Fred Gonzalez, who had been responsible for finding me my very first guitar teacher, Fred was also very invested in my musical development. And I would show up after school, and there would be a CD in the car that Fred had gotten for me and told my parents to give to me. He gave me the first Johnny Winter album, with Tommy Shannon on bass and Uncle John Turner on drums. So whatever unfolds in the rest of this video, because it is unscripted, is coming from that perspective. One of those records that Fred had purchased for me was Country Blues by John Hammond, and then proceeded to take me to see John Hammond. Later on, I started seeking the albums out for myself, and I wound up with So Many Roads from 1965. Well, who's on this record? I don't know. Garth Hudson, Levon Helm, Robbie Robertson. That's 3/5 of the band. Slightly important group to American music. And Richard Manuel and Rick Danko were supposed to be on the record, but Hammond was denied by Vanguard Records. Charlie Musselwhite, who Robin Ford played and recorded with later on, as well as Mike Bloomfield, rounded out the sessions. John Hammond was an important guy, as an important part of the 1960s folk blues boom, when a number of the original players were brought out of retirement and brought to new audiences. But despite this, and if I'm mistaken, please let me know because I don't watch guitar YouTube. But it's a sad observation, and so far, I can see absolutely no guitar YouTuber, no music YouTuber, has said one single word about the passing of John Hammond. This is perplexing, not because the man himself was wildly famous, he wasn't, but because Bob Dylan certainly is, Jimi Hendrix certainly is, Stevie Ray Vaughan certainly was one of the most iconic guitar players of all time, not to mention Billie Holiday and Aretha Franklin. What do they all have in common? John Hammond Jr.'s dad, John Hammond Sr., who got Dylan signed to Columbia Records. The first album bombed, and Dylan was referred to as Hammond's Folly. But the Beatles were listening, and when Dylan went electric at the Newport Folk Festival with Mike Bloomfield, to quote the man who said, "I'm not a folk singer and despise the press," the whole wide world was watching. As Townes Van Zandt said, there are only two kinds of music, the blues and zippity-doo-dah. You don't have to like the blues, but if you want to play music, it's a foundational form, building block, and cultural heritage, and most likely a significant inspiration to those who made the music that you like better. My uncle, who turned me on to the Rolling Stones, never got the blues like I did, but Keith Richards does. If Bob Dylan matters enough to come in number 2 on your all-time greatest singer-songwriters list, then maybe No One Can Sing the Blues Like Blind Willie McTell means something. But it doesn't seem to be that way on YouTube, and that perplexes me. Where is the Music Is Win video on Albert Collins? Why has Rhett Scholl never once mentioned Hubert Sumlin? The guy mattered a whole lot to Eric Clapton and a whole lot to the Rolling Stones, so much so that Mick and Keith paid for his memorial expenses. Possibly if you'd named your son after Dylan. Maybe, just possibly, John Hammond Sr. may have been mentioned on your channel before. What was Dylan inspired by? A lot of the stuff that the man who signed him to Columbia Records, that man's son was inspired by. So much so that by 1961, the young John Hammond was playing guitar, getting ready to perform and make his own records. And John Hammond Jr., as part of that bloodline and heritage, might deserve at least a few words. Where is the Pete Thorne video on Albert King? The archetypes mattered a whole lot to the players who generate a whole lot more clicks. You cannot conceivably even begin to understand the way Eric Clapton plays and approaches the guitar. You cannot remotely fathom that unless you've first gone through Freddie King. B.B. King would be the obvious greatest influence on Michael Bloomfield, and you would hear a certain amount of Albert King in Jimi Hendrix, but a whole lot more Albert King in Stevie Ray Vaughan, because Hendrix was so innovative and so revolutionary that Hendrix just copied everyone and sounded like no one else. Stevie sounded like Albert King and copied a whole ton of Hendrix. It was only really later on, I think, where Stevie really started to form a more unique voice on the guitar. By in step, he sounded like Stevie Ray Vaughan. But Texas Flood, love him as I do, and it was so significant that in childhood, the night before the documentary aired, I was in a state of such anticipation and emotional attachment to Stevie Ray Vaughan that my entire body broke out into hives, and I am not exaggerating or kidding. Stevie Ray Vaughan early on just sounded like Albert King and Jimi Hendrix put into a blender. Jimi Hendrix certainly cared who the young John Hammond was and was performing several of his songs from So Many Roads. Hammond went to check Hendrix out. BB said at the end of his memoir, "In my heart of hearts, I still believe there's prejudice against the blues. Record executives won't say it to your face, but I think they secretly feel blues is too simple, too old-fashioned, too basic to have supermass appeal. In my mind, it's the simplicity of the blues that keeps them alive and makes them timeless. The blues will never die." Think about it. Maybe put on some John Hammond. Maybe check out and see Statesboro Blues when sung and performed by John Hammond is just as captivating as Statesboro Blues when played by the Allman Brothers on Live at the Fillmore East. And if it won't sell records or generate clicks or advance your business, certain things matter more. This stuff matters, and so did 2 generations of John Hammond.